Hi, Ninja Nerds. In this video today, we're going to talk about the medulla oblongata, or as Bobby Boucher from The Waterboy would say, it's because the mama said it's alligator so ornery because they got all them teeth, no toothbrush. All right, guys, so what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the medulla. We're going to have three cross sections, right? We're going to go over all the internal structures of the medulla, just like we did with the midbrain and the pons. What I want to do, though, is we're going to have three sections. I want to explain at what cross section we're looking at, okay? So first thing, let's go ahead and take and just do a frontal section. So basically, I'm going to take and slice right here, okay? And we're going to look at this at three levels, right? So here, you have midbrain, here's pons, here's your medulla, and then continuation to the spinal cord, right? First, completeness sake, we have the cerebellum. Now, what we're going to do is, here's from this point here to this point here is our medulla, okay? The first one that we're going to look at, the first level, I'm going to slice it here with this red, is we're going to look at this level here. This transverse section or cross section is going to be at the pons medulla junction. This is going to be, this section here, section 1, is the most superior aspect or section of the medulla, or another word that might come up is the most rostral portion of the medulla. Then what we'll do is we'll come at another level here, kind of within the middle. This middle portion is where we're going to call the sensory decussation. This is where you have that nucleus cuneatus, nucleus gracilis. They're receiving the sensory information from the fasciculus gracilis, fasciculus cuneatus, and they cross and go up as the medial lemniscus. That's going to be the second part. Then we're going to come down here at the last part, the most inferior or caudal portion of the medulla. And this is going to be at the pyramidal decussation. So that's when you have those corticospinal fibers that are coming down and they're going to cross at that level. The lateral ones cross. 85% cross into the lateral column and 15% stay straight in the ventral column, right? So three sections. First one's going to be here at the top. The middle one's going to be here on the bottom, and the third one's going to be here at this right. Okay? So let's go ahead and start focusing on the most rostral portion. All right, engineers, so let's go ahead here and start with the rostral portion. Okay, this part here is the most superior, most rostral component of that medulla cross section, right? And again, just to give you guys some orientation, this portion here is the ventral portion of the medulla. This portion back here is the dorsal portion of the medulla, right? What we're going to do is, to help you guys out, is we're going to start here at this structure here, and we're going to kind of work our way in a circle. And the nice thing is that this video is going to be very repetitious, because a lot of the things that you see at this level, you're going to see at pretty much all the other levels. So it's going to be very, very consistent, repetitious. By the end of this video, you guys will know this completely well, okay? So let's go ahead and start here with this first structure that's paired on both sides. If you guys look at this guy, this is called your hypoglossal nucleus. Hypoglossal nucleus is what cranial nerve? It's cranial nerve 12. So again, what is this guy? We're going to have a key. It's a pretty long key, but it's the best thing that we could do here so we don't have arrows coming all over the place making this diagram is not very nice. So again, first one here, orange nucleus, that is going to be the hypoglossal nucleus. Okay, this is for what cranial nerve? Cranial nerve 12, okay? Next one, we got this structure. We're going to move a little bit. We're going to keep moving laterally and then forward, okay? So now we go here outside, just a little bit lateral to the hypoglossal nucleus. What is this guy? This is the dorsal nucleus of vagus. Again, what is he? Dorsal nucleus of vagus. And again, what cranial nerve is the vagus nerve? This is cranial nerve 10. So again, hypoglossal nucleus and the dorsal nucleus of vagus. Move out a little bit more laterally and a little bit more anterior. What do we have here? We got this guy, the nucleus of tractus solitarius, right? So what is he called? The nucleus of tractus solitarius. All right, this guy is so cool. And again, we'll discuss more of their functions in a second. I just want to go ahead and start off by knowing the structures, then we'll get more into their function, okay? So hypoglossal nucleus, dorsal nucleus of vagus, what's a little bit more lateral and anterior? The nucleus of tractus solitarius. Okay, go out a little bit more. So a little bit more laterally. You have these two structures that are part of a whole nuclear complex. This is actually the vestibular complex, right? The vestibular nuclear complex. But if you guys remember in the pons video, we had four components of it. the superior, the lateral, the medial, and the inferior vestibular nuclear complex. If you guys remember in the pons video, you can really only see the superior, the lateral, and parts of the medial vestibular nucleus. You can't see the inferior at the pons, right? That lowest section of the pons. Now, in the medulla, you can see parts of the medial vestibular nucleus and primarily the inferior vestibular nucleus. So again, what are these two structures here? These are your medial and inferior. So medial and inferior vestibular nucleus. Okay, sweet. Next guy, these green guys. So we're going to move a little bit more laterally. Hypoglossal nucleus, dorsal nucleus of vagus, nucleus of tractus solitarius, medial inferior vestibular nucleus. More laterally, you got your dorsocochlear nuclei and your ventrocochlear nuclei. Again, dorsal, more in the dorsal component of the medulla. Ventral, more in the ventral portion of the medulla. Pretty self-explanatory, right, guys? So again, what do we got? Dorsal and ventral. And ventral cochlear nuclei. Sweet deal. Okay, go a little bit more laterally. Over here, you got this big white matter tract. Okay, this is the white matter connection between primarily the medulla and the cerebellum. I know you guys know this. This is the inferior cerebellar peduncles. So again, what are these? The inferior cerebellar peduncles. Sweet deal. Again, what is this? This is that white matter connection between primarily the medulla and the cerebellum. Okay, what do we got here? Again, hypoglossal nucleus, dorsal nucleus of vagus, nucleus of tractus solitarius, medial inferior vestibular nucleus, dorsal cochlear nuclei, ventral cochlear nuclei, inferior cerebellar peduncles. Move out a little bit more laterally. What do you got here? This is the pontobulbar body. Okay, what is this little green here called? This is that pontobulbar body. Okay, and again, we'll talk about its relationship with this kind of blue fiber in a second. Okay. Okay, move a little bit more anterior now. What do we got? We got this pink tract here. What is this guy called? This is your ventral spinocerebellar tract. Okay, so what is he called? Your ventral spinocerebellar tract. Sweet deal. Okay, move a little bit more anterior here. What do we got? We got our inferior olivary nuclear complex. Again, what is this guy here? This little weird looking U-shaped thing? That son of a gun right there is the inferior olivary nucleus. Okay? And we'll talk a lot about this guy a little bit later when we get to his function. Okay? All right, move a little bit more. Again, kind of medially and anteriorly here, we hit this blue structure. What is this guy called? This guy is the arcuate nucleus. So again, what is he called here? We have him as the arcuate nucleus. Okay, I want to take some time to explain what the heck all these like blue structures are moving all around the place. The arcuate nucleus is really cool because what it does is, let's say again, this is our left medulla, right? The part of it, the left section of it, and this is the right section of the medulla, right? So if I were to kind of slice this in half, this is the left, this is the right. This left arcuate nucleus gives fibers that moves to the contralateral side as you see here, and it also gives ipsilateral fibers moving that you see here, okay? Now, these fibers, when they cross, they form these contralateral connections that move along these kind of like little divots on the anterior portion of the medulla and work their way towards this pontobulbar body. What are these fibers here called? These are called your anterior external arcuate fibers. Again, what are they called? Anterior external arcuate fibers. And again, they are connecting between what? The arcuate nuclei and the pontobulbar body. Okay? But again, they have contralateral connection. Okay? Arcuate nuclei are actually interesting because they're believed to be the inferior kind of portion of the pontine nuclei. Remember those? We had the pontine nuclei and that pons. These are just believed to be an inferior extension of those pontine nuclei, and they're believed to play some type of role in maybe sleep, okay? So again, you have these actually sleep and more of the breathing processes as well. But again, what I want you to know here, arcuate nucleus has the connections going to the pontobulbar bodies as the anterior external arcuate fibers. Now, these arcuate nuclei also give fibers that move on the same side so far. So this is ipsilateral. So from the left arcuate nucleus, this is the left. From the right arcuate nucleus, this is that right fiber. They're coming and working their way posteriorly through the midline of the medulla. As they work their way posteriorly through the midline of the medulla, they cross. So they come out the back and eventually they cross. And when they cross, they form another special structure. But look where they're moving towards. They're moving towards this pontobulbar body. Okay, so again, arcuate nucleus gives its fibers that work posteriorly and cross to the contralateral side, to that contralateral bulbar body. So again, right arcuate nucleus will give its fibers, and this will cross over here. What is this blue structure here in the back of the medulla? This is an important one, and we already talked about this in the pons. This is called the stria medullaris. This is called the stria medullaris. The stria medullaris is really important because do you remember what we said about that structure? Remember we said that the fourth ventricle in the posterior part of the brainstem, at the pons and medulla area, you have the fourth ventricle. Forming the anterior wall of that fourth ventricle, right, was the pons and the medulla. Above the stria medullaris, that fourth ventricle anterior wall was formed by the pons. Below the stria medullaris, right, the anterior wall of that fourth ventricle is formed by the medulla. And again, that is that stria medullaris. All right, so we hit this arcuate nucleus. Let's move a little bit more dorsally, right? So we've kind of gone from here, working our way around, okay? This kind of red, dicey-like structure here is called the corticospinal tracts, right? So this is going to be the corticospinal tracts. You guys remember those, coming from the cortex, moving down to the spinal cord, those are motor pathways. So again, what is those called? Those is called the corticospinal tract. All right, sweet. Let's move a little bit more dorsally. So we're kind of just working our way around here. Now we're coming to this guy, this maroon son of a gun. What is this guy? This is our medial lemniscus. Medial lemniscus. Who comes up with these names, you know? So medial lemniscus. You guys remember this guy? You guys better remember him. We've talked about him so much. Again, this guy carries that proprioceptive information, that fine discriminative touch, that vibration sensations through that dorsal column. Again, we'll recap it a little bit later. Okay, we hit this one. Let's go here now. So we're again working our way around here to this purple structure. What is this guy? This purple, where's my purple marker? Oh, I got it here. This guy right here is called the spinal lemniscus. What is he called? The spinal lemniscus. Okay, so good. We hit that one. So we went through here. We hit the medial lemniscus. We hit the spinal lemniscus. Now what we're going to do is we're going to kind of work over here, and then we'll come back here to the middle, okay? So we're going to go here and work our way here. So now let's cover this structure. This guy right here is called, we've seen him so many times. This is one of the trigeminal nuclei. Remember, at the medulla, at the midbrain, it's the mesencephalic nucleus. At the pon, it's the principal pontine or central pontine nuclei. And in the medulla, it is the spinal nucleus of the trigeminal nerve. And associated with it is the trigeminal tract. Now, I'm going to write these down, but I want to explain something a little bit better than I did in the pons video with this one so that we completely understand this one. Okay, so again, this is the spinal nucleus. And this is the tract. And this is for what? Of cranial nerve 5, the trigeminal nerve. I want to take some time just really quickly to explain what this means. Okay, so here I'm going to draw a sagittal section here. So, okay, cerebrum, midbrain, pons, medulla, spinal cord, cerebellum, right? since we have this in that kind of navy blue color, I'm going to have here spinal nucleus of the trigeminal nerve, that central or principal pontine nuclei, and the mesencephalic nucleus. All of these are for the trigeminal nerve, right? If you guys remember from the trigeminal nerve video, we had that trigeminal ganglion, right? That gave off the V1, V2, V3 divisions, right? All those different things we talk about in that video. We're not going to go over that. But remember, they're picking up sensory information from in the entire face on the ipsilateral side. When they send this information in and they go to these individual nuclei, this right here is the trigeminal tract, okay? Or that spinal tract. Okay, so again, this part here, since we're talking about the spinal nucleus, this right here is that tract. That's the spinal tract of the trigeminal nerve. Then what we said is, coming off of these nuclei, they give their fibers that move upwards towards the thalamus. What is that structure called? That is the trigeminal lemniscus, or the trigeminal thalamic tract. So again, I want to make sure we understand that this is the trigeminal lemniscus, or the trigeminal thalamic tract, coming from these nuclei, and this right here is the trigeminal tract, particularly at this portion here. This is the spinal tract. Okay? All right. Let's go ahead and move on to the next structure here. All right, so the next one we got here. We went this way, medial lemniscus, spinal nucleus, and tract. Let's kind of come back over here to the middle, okay? So now we got this guy, this kind of blue tract here. What is this son of a gun? This guy is the tectospinal tract. There's so many things in the medulla, it's insane, right? So tectospinal tract. Again, this is that tract we talked about already so many times. It's involved with what? The reflexive movements of the head and the eyes in response to superior colliculus is visual stimulus. Inferior colliculus is auditory stimulus. Done. Next one, let's move out just a little bit back here. So a little bit more posterior than a little bit laterally here. What do we got? We got this rubrospinal tract. We've talked about this one about 1,000 times. What does this guy do? He carries descending motor pathways. Rubrospinal tract carries descending motor pathways from the red nucleus in the midbrain down to the spinal cord that can play a role with flexor movement. Okay? Done. Go a little bit backwards, a little bit more dorsally. So we hit medial lemniscus, spinal lemniscus. Again, we hit the tectospinal, rubrospinal. We're at this green guy. This is another one that we've hit like 1,000 times. This is the medial longitudinal fasciculus. What is he called? The medial longitudinal fasciculus. Again, what does this guy do? He connects the medial vestibular nucleus, right? He sends the information to the sixth nerve nucleus. That sixth nerve nucleus sends contralateral fibers up that connects the third, fourth, and sixth cranial nerve nuclei. So again, it's the connection between the 3, 4, 6 cranial nerve nuclei. Helps with conjugate movement of the eyes. Boom, done. Go a little bit more backwards here. So a little bit more posteriorly. We hit this black tract. Nucleus ambiguus. All right, weird name. All right, nucleus ambiguus, but it's actually a really cool structure here, responsible for the special visceral efferent fibers, which is going to be supplying muscles of your pharyngeal arches, and we'll talk about those later. All right, sweet. Move a little bit more laterally here. What do we got here? This brown one here is the inferior salivatory nucleus. All right, so this is the inferior salivatory nucleus. Again, so what is he? He's the inferior salivatory nucleus. This is actually specifically related to the glossopharyngeal nerve, right? So it connects, the glossopharyngeal nerve has that general visceral efferent fibers, and that basically connects to what's called the otic ganglion. It has fibers that go from this nucleus out to the otic ganglion, and then has parasympathetic fibers that go from that to the parotid gland, right? So it plays a role in salivation. All right, sweet. So we hit the nucleus ambiguus, we hit the inferior salivatory nucleus. We got one more guy here. And this one here, as you move a little bit laterally here, what is this one? This one right here is actually super interesting. This is actually your descending sympathetic tract, okay, coming from the hypothalamus. We'll explain that later, okay? So again, what is this one? We have them a little bit down here. This one here, this blue one here with the dots, this is that sympathetic tract. And again, it's a descending tract, all right? Sweet. We hit a bunch of structures here within this most rostral portion, this cross section of the medulla at the pons medulla junction. Now we're going to move caudally, right? So we're going to go a little bit, we're going to take another slice, kind of a little bit lower in the medulla, a little bit more caudally, inferiorly. All right, so now again, we have a cross section. At what level? The sensory decussation. And again, that's what I want you to remember. When we did up there was pons medulla junction. This section that's more caudal is at the sensory decussation. We'll explain what that means in a second. Again, let's start from the posterior aspect, work our way around here. A lot of this stuff is going to be things that we already covered. We'll pick up a couple structures along the way though. So it's going to be good repetition, okay? So now, work here. What is this structure here in the most dorsal? Again, dorsal back here, ventral here. This is going to be, what is this? This is the fasciculus gracilis. So again, what is this guy here? This blue tract here. This is a tract. So it's called the fasciculus gracilis. The fasciculus gracilis is taking that sensory information, right, from the dorsal column carrying proprioception, fine discriminative touch, vibrations. But where is this fasciculus, this tract coming from? I want you to remember that this is coming from the lower extremities, okay? So lower extremity, proprioception, fine discriminative touch, and vibrations. This fasciculus gracilis is eventually going to terminate on this nucleus a little bit more ventral. What is this guy? Well, this is the fasciculus gracilis. It terminates on the nucleus gracilis. So what is this guy here? Nucleus gracilis. All right, sweet. Now, move a little bit more laterally, okay? As we move a little bit more laterally, so again, you get your nucleus, you get your fasciculus gracilis and your nucleus gracilis. Move a little bit more laterally. You have your fasciculus cuneatus and your nucleus cuneatus. So again, what is this son of a gun here? This is the fasciculus cuneatus, and this is the nucleus cuneatus. All right. Again, fasciculus cuneatus, it's carrying proprioceptive sensation, fine and discriminative touch, vibrations from the upper extremities, okay? And even a little bit from the trunk, okay? So again, it's picking up sensations from the upper extremities. Gracilis is lower extremities. Simple as that. Okay, cool. We hit the sympathetic tract already. So if we were to move laterally, we know that what we would have here is the sympathetic tract. And again, we already covered this structure. What is this structure here called? This is the inferior cerebellar peduncle. So again, we've hit fasciculus gracilis, fasciculus cuneatus, nucleus gracilis, nucleus cuneatus, inferior cerebellar peduncle, and the sympathetic tract. All right, cool. You guys already know this one. What's this thing? We already covered it above. This is the spinal nucleus and the spinal tract of what cranial nerve? Cranial nerve 5, the trigeminal nerve. Okay, move a little bit more anteriorly. This is a new one. We didn't cover this one before. This is the orange structure here. This is another tract, okay? This one, if you guys remember, what was the pink one? This was the ventral spinocerebellar tract. This one's just a little bit more dorsal. What do you think it's called? The dorsal spinocerebellar tract, right? So this is the dorsal spinocerebellar tract. Sweet deal. So again, we hit our sympathetic tract, we hit the spinal nucleus and tract, we hit our dorsal spinocerebellar tract. We already know what this one is, guys. This is your ventral spinocerebellar tract. Move a little bit more anteriorly here. What do we got here? This kind of bluish guy here actually is going to be a tract. It's going to actually be a descending tract. This is your olivospinal tract. So again, what is this guy here? This is the olivospinal tract. Again, we'll discuss this tract a little bit more in detail, but again, it's going from the inferior olivary nuclear complex down to your spinal cord, to the lower motor neurons, okay, which will go out to your muscles. And again, we'll explain that later. Move a little bit more medially here. What do we got? We had olivospinal. What do we got here? This is actually spinal olivary tract. Okay, so this one is the spinal olivary tract. So again, I want to make sure we understand here. Let's go over it again, right? What is this one? This is the olivospinal tract, from inferior olives to the spinal cord. This is the spinal olivary tract, coming from the spinal cord, from sensations, proprioceptive sensations, okay? Bringing it up through this to the inferior olivary nuclear complex, okay? So we understand that. Okay, cool. So we covered the the olivospinal tract and the spinal olivary tract. Let's move a little bit more medially here. We already covered this one. What is he? This is your inferior olivary nucleus. Move a little bit more medially. We already covered this one. What is this guy? Your corticospinal tracts. Move posteriorly a little bit. You're starting to see some of the formation of what was that structure above? The medial lemniscus. We'll explain what I'm talking about in just a second. Okay, but again, you're starting to see the beginnings of the medial lemniscus. Work here. What do we have? What was right behind the medial lemniscus? The tectospinal tract. What was just behind the tectospinal tract? The medial longitudinal fasciculus. Let's come out here for a second. I want to cover these last because we already know these. Let's cover this. Let's move over here. What do we got here? What is this green structure here? This green structure, if you guys remember before, it was one big clump called the spinal lemniscus, right? Do you guys remember what were the components of the spinal lemniscus? So again, just more rostrally, at the section above, this thing right here was the spinal lemniscus. Spinal lemniscus, I want you to remember three primary, there's a lot of things, but three primary components of it. This one right here is the lateral spinal thalamic tract. So the green one is the lateral spinal thalamic tract. Okay, so lateral spinal thalamic tract. What does this carry? This carries that pain and temperature sensations from the contralateral side. What is this one here? This purple one here. This guy is your spinotectal tract. This is your spinotectal tract. So this is picking up sensations from the body and taking it to the tectum, okay? Which again is that superior colliculus and inferior colliculus. Move a little bit more anteriorly here. What do we got here? This blue one. This is your ventral spinal thalamic tract, okay? Or your anterior spinal thalamic tract. We're just going to do ventral spinal thalamic tract, okay? And again, the ventral spinal thalamic tract, you guys know what this carries. This bad boy is carrying that crude touch and pressure sensations from the contralateral aspect of the body. These three components will eventually, as they start moving and ascending rostrally or more superiorly, they'll fuse together and become the spinal lemniscus. Okay, but they haven't formed yet. So that's what I want you to remember. That's the only kind of big thing that's really different at this point. We also have another structure. Do you guys remember we had the vestibular nuclei, the medial and the inferior vestibular nuclei? Well, what happens is the medial and primarily the lateral vestibular nuclei give off fibers that descend downwards as a particular tract. What is that called? The vestibulospinal tract. This is the vestibulospinal tract. So again, what is this black structure here? This is the vestibulospinal tract. What does this guy do? He's carrying descending motor pathways for your extensor muscles, anti-gravity muscles. Okay? Boom. Last portion here. Okay, in this dorsal gray matter component of the medulla, you have some nuclei. We already know these. What was the orange nuclei in the most dorsal aspect? That was the hypoglossal nucleus. That was cranial nerve 12 nuclei. More laterally, the purple ones was the dorsal nucleus of vagus. Dorsal nucleus of vagus, again, that is going to be for cranial nerve 10. And then more laterally to that was the nucleus of tractus solitarius, right? And again, we'll talk about its significance in just a second. But that is kind of the big structures that we talked about. The only other thing I want to make sure we understand here and explain is this sensory decussation. So if you guys remember, very simple kind of concept here. Here we are going to have two diagrams that I want to explain here. So we'll have two diagrams. So remember, coming into the spinal cord, you had that sensory information, right? This is coming basically from your proprioceptors, right? For proprioceptors from muscle, tendons, joints, all that stuff. let's say that this is coming from the legs. What they do is they move into the spinal cord more medially and then ascend upwards. And then if you had, again, some more proprioceptive sensations coming from the arms, this will ascend inwards, this will move in and then ascend upwards a little bit more laterally. So again, if we had the midline through the brainstem and the spinal cord, the most medial portion here is going to be, through that dorsal column, is going to be picking up sensations from the lower extremities. The more lateral is going to be picking up sensations from the arms. This bundle, this kind of arrow going up, is the fasciculus gracilis. This one coming up here from the arms is the fasciculus cuneatus. Eventually, they terminate at nuclei in the medulla. The nuclei that's more medial is the nucleus gracilis. The nuclei that's more lateral is the nucleus cuneatus. So again, here's our nucleus, lateral ones, nucleus cuneatus. Synapses on the nucleus cuneatus. Fasciculus gracilis is going to be the more medially ones. They are going to synapse on the nucleus gracilis. Okay? And then what happens is the fibers of the nucleus, again, lateral one is cuneatus, medial one is the gracilis, they are going to cross and move to the contralateral side. So they're going to cross this way. If it were coming from this side, they would also cross and move to the contralateral side. That crossing right here is the sensory decussation, and that's what we see at this point here. So the fibers that are coming from the nucleus gracilis and the nucleus cuneatus are crossing and going into this component here. What the heck is this son of a gun? That's our medial lemniscus. We talked about it here. So what is this fibers? After they cross and go up, what is this? Medial lemniscus on the left side. What is this one? Medial lemniscus on the right side. So again, they cross and then ascend upwards as the medial lemniscus. Beautiful. So that explains the rostral and the middle section of the medulla. Let's finish up, hit it home with the most caudal portion. All right, so now we're at the last section of the medulla. We hit the first top section, okay? Pontomedullary junction. We hit the middle section at the level of the sensory decussation. Now we're at the most caudal, inferior, lowest portion of the medulla, and this is at the pyramidal decussation. Okay, a lot of this stuff is going to already be very familiar, so we're just going to abbreviate it. The only one that we'll kind of write out is the only thing that's really different here. All right, so let's start here dorsally and just kind of do what we've been doing, kind of working our way back around. So again, at the most dorsal aspect, you guys better know this. What is this guy? This is your fasciculus gracilis. Again, they're paired, right? And then associated with it, where it will terminate, is the nucleus gracilis. More laterally is the fasciculus cuneatus. Again, they're paired. They'll terminate eventually on the nucleus cuneatus. This one's a little bit different. You saw this at another area, but this is your spinal tract for that trigeminal nerve. And this is the spinal nucleus of the trigeminal nerve. So again, they're paired. Spinal tract of the trigeminal nerve and spinal nucleus of the trigeminal nerve. This, we already know this. This was your sympathetic tract, that descending sympathetic tract. And again, you don't see that hypoglossal nucleus, you don't see the dorsal nucleus vagus, you don't see the nucleus subtractus solitarius here. What do we see? We see this guy. This was our dorsal spinocerebellar tract. This is our ventral spinocerebellar tract. Again, they're paired, dorsal spinocerebellar, ventral spinocerebellar tract. Then we had this guy. This was the olivospinal tract, going from the inferior olives down to the spinal cord. This is your spinal olivary tract, coming from the spinal cord, going up to the inferior olives. Then, we already covered this, but this is going to be what? This is your corticospinal tracts. And again, we'll write here, corticospinal tracts. We'll explain this in a little bit more detail in a second. Then, what do we have here? We already hit this one. This was your vestibulospinal tract. So this is your vestibulospinal tract. This was carrying that descending motor pathways for the extensor muscles. This was the three components that eventually become the spinal lemniscus. This is your lateral spinal thalamic tract. This is your spinal tectal tract. This is your, what is this? This is your ventral spinal thalamic tract. Okay, so again, they're paired, lateral spinal thalamic tract, spinal tectal tract, and then ventral spinal thalamic tract. The other thing we actually should add in here is, again, what else do we have coming down? This was our tectospinal tract, right? And again, that was coming from the tectum, We should have had that one in there. And then again, you're also going to have your, we'll put it right here. This is your rubrospinal tract, right? And that's going to be coming from the red nucleus coming down. So again, what do you have here? Your tectospinal tract paired. And then up here, you're going to have your rubrospinal tracts. And again, this is going to be going to the distal muscles for the upper extremities for flexion. And again, you'll notice here that we don't have the medial longitudinal fasciculus. We don't have the medial lemniscus because it hasn't been formed yet at this part. Okay? All right, the only thing that I really want to kind of end here is this pyramidal decussation. I want to explain this. So again, you guys remember, if we had like a little mini diagram here. Here's our midbrain, pons, medulla, going down into the spinal cord, right? So again, here we'll kind of do this here. Here's our medulla, midbrain here, pons there, and again, spinal cord down at the bottom here. If you guys remember, the corticospinal fibers, right? Coming from the cortex, so it'll come from an upper motor neuron, come down through the midbrain, come down through the pons, scatter through the pontine nuclei, come to the level of the pyramids, and when it gets to the bottom part of the pyramids, it crosses over and then descends downwards, right? Then, same thing, if it was coming from the right side, comes down through the midbrain, through the crus cerebri, through the pons, through that scatters around the pontine nuclei, moves through the pyramids at the most lower part, it crosses over and comes down as the corticospinal tracts, right? The ones that cross, these are going to be crossing and forming the lateral corticospinal tracts. Again, we'll explain this in just a little bit in a second, but again, this portion here, you see how this is going to be the corticospinal fibers that are coming through the pyramids? Some of these fibers that cross and descend downwards, cross and descend downwards, 85% of these corticospinal fibers do it. And they will form the lateral corticospinal tract. Okay, so again, what is this guy here? Some from these corticospinal fibers descending down through the pyramids, some will cross, 85% of them, and will descend downwards. And this is going to be your lateral corticospinal tract. Okay, some of the fibers, 15% of them, will not cross. So they won't cross and they'll just descend downwards and eventually come down to the spinal cord, and at the level that they're going to be stimulating those motor neurons, they'll cross. And that's your ventral corticospinal tract. That accounts for about 15%, okay? But this portion here, where the corticospinal fibers cross and move downwards as the lateral corticospinal tract, what is this called? This is called the pyramidal decussation. Okay, so the pyramidal decussation. All right. So we've covered that. Now that we have covered the most caudal portion, the most inferior, the bottom portion of the medulla, what I want to do is just really quickly cover some of the cranial nerves to recap what we've covered and to cover a little bit of the external anatomy of the medulla. Then what we'll do is we'll start talking about a lot of the functions of a lot of these structures there, okay? All right, so the last thing I want to do here, kind of covering the anatomy, so we kind of hit home this medulla neuroanatomy thing, is covering a little bit of this external anatomy. So a lot of us will see, you know, whenever we're looking at the brainstem in this kind of coronal view here, right? This is the anterior kind of portion of the brainstem, midbrain, pons, medulla, spinal cord, cerebellum, right? Some of the big things that we should understand is when you look here at the medulla, right? So again, medulla is going to be, you see how this kind of have like this little jaggedy line here? From this portion here, that's all medulla. You have this line coming right down the middle. That's your anterior median fissure, okay? Then you have these lines over here, and these are called your anterior lateral sulcus. There's a reason why I'm explaining this. Just give it a second. And then the most outer ones here is your posterior lateral sulcus. And again, this kind of wavy line, just above it is the pons. So this is that pons medulla junction. So again, real quick recap. Anterior median fissure, anterior lateral sulcus, posterior lateral sulcus. This is that pons medulla junction, right? Okay. What I want us to know is all the cranial nerves that are coming off of the pons medulla junction the anterolateral sulcus and the posterior lateral sulcus. And then what are the names of this, and then some of these other structures that we'll cover just as an aside. All right, first thing, let's cover some of the nerves that are here on this pontomedullary junction. Easiest thing to do is to kind of make a line to go right down the middle, because this is all paired. All right, first one, let's cover the blue ones here. Okay, right at this pontomedullary junction here, what are these two cranial nerves? I want you to remember that this is cranial nerve 6, or the abducens nerve, okay? Go a little bit more laterally on this pons medulla junction here. What is this guy here? This is your facial nerve, or cranial nerve 7. All right, cool. Let's go a little bit more laterally. On this pons medulla junction, what is this called? The green component is for the cochlear nuclei, the ventral dorsocochlear nuclei, right? So that's the cochlear branch. The red one is going to the superior, medial, inferior, and lateral vestibular nuclei. That's the vestibular branch. This is the vestibulocochlear nerve, or cranial nerve 8. Okay, and it's paired here. Okay, sweet. Let's move down. So we got 8. We're going to come here on this posterior lateral sulcus. So anterior median fissure, anterior lateral sulcus, posterior lateral sulcus. On the most top portion of this guy here is going to be cranial nerve 9, or the glossopharyngeal nerve. So again, this is the glossopharyngeal nerve. A little bit more caudal, or inferiorly, we have this guy. This is cranial nerve 10, or the vagus nerve. Sweet. And at the most inferior portion, a tiny little portion of this outer posterior lateral sulcus around the inferior portion of the medulla, you have this kind of bluish one. This is the accessory nerve, and it's the cranial part of the accessory nerve, okay, because there's two parts of the accessory nerve. One part of the accessory nerve is coming off of the medulla, and another part is coming from the cervical segments of the spinal cord, like C1 all the way down to like C4, okay? So again, this is the spinal component, which is coming from C1 to C4, and then this is the cranial component. All right, sweet. Now come more medially onto this anterior lateral sulcus. On the anterior lateral sulcus, we have these guys. What are these? This is cranial nerve 12. And cranial nerve 12 is the hypoglossal nerve. Okay? Okay, we covered that. Next thing, we give a specific name to these little fat bulges coming out the anterior portion of the medulla. What is this guy? This is your pyramids, and they're paired, okay? Then you got two other fat bulges, okay, on the lateral sides of the pyramids. This is your olives. Okay, so the anterior median fissure separates the two pyramids, and the anterior lateral sulcus separates the olives. Sweet. From olives from the pyramids. Okay, then we got these little tubes that are connecting the three parts of the brainstem to the cerebellum. In order, at this level is the inferior cerebellar peduncle. So what is this guy here? This is your inferior cerebellar peduncle. This one here is your middle cerebellar peduncle. And at the most superior portion between the midbrain and the cerebellum is the superior cerebellar peduncle. So again, superior cerebellar peduncle, middle cerebellar peduncle, inferior cerebellar peduncle. Okay? Now, while we're here, might as well hit some other structures. What is this cranial nerve nuclei? It's always good to do repetition. It's the best way to learn, right? What is this cranial nerve nuclei here? This is cranial nerve 5, the trigeminal nerve. That's kind of at the pons, right? So we hit that section in the pons video. Then you come over here, and we got two cranial nerves coming out of the midbrain. One's coming through that interpeduncular fossa. What is this son of a gun? This is cranial nerve 3, oculomotor nerve. And then this last one that kind of comes around the back, crosses, and comes around the sides of the midbrain. This is cranial nerve 4, or the trochlear nerve. Okay? So this covers that nice little external anatomy questions that kind of come up that you might see on certain exams for the medulla. All right, now let's hit it home with the general functions of a lot of these structures. The structure is complementing the function. So it's not just important for us to know what is the name of this structure? Okay, what is the name of this fiber? What is the name of this nucleus? We need to know kind of an idea of what these things do. So we're going to kind of have a general overview on some of these things because we have more detailed videos that cover these topics exclusively. Okay, this will be a 3-hour video if we go through everything. Okay, so we're going to cover it generally. First thing we're going to cover is these corticospinal tracts, these descending motor pathways. We've already talked about this so many times. You guys know this, like the back of your hand. So again, we have these upper motor neurons, right? Coming from the primary motor cortex, the premotor cortex, the primary somatosensory area, all sending these corticospinal fibers down. They move their way down. They go through the, you guys remember the internal capsule. They'll move through the crus cerebri. They'll move through the pons and kind of scatter. They scatter around some of those pontine nuclei, but then some of them reform. And eventually they come to the medulla. And they move through that pyramid, that big fat chunky thing here in the anterior portion. And when they do that, they move down through this portion of the pyramids. And what happens is these corticospinal fibers, remember I told you, as we get to the lowest portion of the pyramids, some of the fibers will cross and then move a little bit posteriorly and then descend downwards. Do you guys remember what those fibers were? Whenever they cross, they move a little bit posteriorly and then descend downwards. And they descend downwards into the lateral white column. Okay? What was that decussation called? That was called here we'll abbreviate it, pyramidal decussation, right? And the fibers that move laterally and descend downwards, this is your lateral corticospinal tract. Now, this was 85% of the fibers that are crossing. We said that some of the fibers will not cross and will just descend downwards into the ventral column, okay? Some of the fibers will not cross and will descend down into the ventral column, and eventually at the level, they'll cross, okay? Stimulating those lower motor neurons. Here, we'll represent this to really differentiate the color. We'll do blue. So here, we'll have some blue motor neurons here that are coming out, right? So ventral cross at that level, dorsal crosses at the lateral crosses at the pyramids, and they'll synapse on these lower motor neurons. So again, lateral corticospinal tracts are 85% of the fibers that decussate at the level of the pyramids. The ones here that are ventral, that don't cross at the level of the pyramids, is the ventral corticospinal tract. They account for about 15%. Lateral corticospinal tract accounts for about 85%. Okay? And again, this will stimulate the lower motor neurons that will go out to your skeletal muscles to allow for contraction of those skeletal muscles. Simple concept there. Okay? So again, that's covering the corticospinal fibers with the pyramidal decussation, covering the ventral corticospinal and the lateral corticospinal tract. Let's move over. Okay, now we're going to cover these sensory pathways that I think we've hit like a million times, but it's worth going over and hitting it home one more time. So, you guys remember, we had the medial lemniscus and the spinal lemniscus. We already talked about the trigeminal lemniscus, so we can kind of knock that one out for right now. But you guys remember, dorsal column, right? Picks up medial lemniscus. This is picking up sensations, proprioception, vibration, fine discriminated touch. Taking this in to the posterior gray horn, right? You guys know it moves into the posterior gray horn. And then as it moves into the posterior gray horn, it moves into the dorsal white column. When it moves into that dorsal white column, it then ascends upwards. If it's picking the sensory information from the legs, it's going to be coming up as the fasciculus gracilis. If it's coming from the upper extremities, which is more laterally, that's the fasciculus cuneatus. We know this, okay? Let's repeat it though. Again, coming here is the fasciculus gracilis. Coming here is the fasciculus cuneatus. They'll eventually come up and they'll synapse on the medial is the nucleus gracilis, lateral is the nucleus cuneatus, and these fibers will cross. And whenever these fibers cross, what is that cross called? That's called the sensory decussation. But then whenever they're kind of moving towards that decussation, before the decussation, that's called the internal arcuate fibers. So just before they cross over is the internal arcuate fibers, but the decussation is called the sensory decussation. Then they ascend upwards as the medial lemniscus. We've We've knocked that cold, right? We know that now. Okay. Hit another one. Let's say here we have pain, temperature, crude touch, pressure. All of those sensations are coming in, dorsal root ganglion coming into the dorsal gray horn, synapsing on the neurons in the dorsal gray horn, and then crossing over. If it's the pain and temperature, it's going laterally and then ascending upwards. If it's crude touch and pressure, it's going ventral and ascending laterally. Again, there's also the spinotectal pathway that'll eventually fuse. But if, again, the one that's going ventrally, that's your ventral spinal thalamic tract. The one going laterally for pain and temperature is the lateral spinal thalamic tract. And again, another tract that will come in here, I'll just add him in blue here, is your spinotectal tract. What happens when the lateral spinal thalamic tract, ventral spinal thalamic tract, and the spinal tectal tract come together and fuse? They make the spinal lemniscus. So what is this called? Spinal lemniscus. And some of these will go to the thalamus, some of it will give collaterals off to the reticular formation, a lot of different components of that pathway. Okay? We already covered the trigeminal lemniscus. So again, we know the medial lemniscus, we know the spinal lemniscus. That's good. And again, we know the trigeminal lemniscus. So we can move on. Next thing that I got to talk about that's a little bit different is the inferior olives. Now, you guys remember the inferior olives are very important. We've talked about this in a couple different videos, some in the descending tract video, some in the cerebellar video. So this kind of might be a recap, but again, it's important for us to just kind of quickly go over this, give a general concept. Remember I told you that there was two tracts that we talked about in the medulla. Okay, we had the spino-olivary tracts and the olivospinal tracts. And this is important. It's pretty simple though, right? Spino-olivary is sensations coming from the spine, going to the olives. Olivospinal is going from the olives down to the spinal cord and out to the muscles. So let's kind of talk about that. Okay, olivospinal pathway. It's relatively simple. You have, again, dorsal root ganglion here, sensations. And again, what kind of sensations is this? This is proprioceptive sensations, okay? This is a little bit of pressure and touch that is going to be sending information to these inferior olives. Okay, so again, these are going to be coming from proprioceptors from muscles, spindles, joint capsules, ligaments, tendons, all of that stuff. Sending that information into the dorsal gray horn. And then what happens is it crosses over into this kind of like ventral portion of the white column and then ascends upwards here to the inferior olives. Okay? So again, here's an inferior olive, here's an inferior olive. Now, when these fibers cross over to this ventral white column, ascend upwards, go to the inferior olives will then take this sensory information and they do something really cool here. They cross it over to the contralateral cerebellum, right? So in the same way here, if it was coming from this side, right? So here you're going to have proprioceptors, and vibration, all of that stuff coming in here, synapsing on the dorsal root ganglion, crossing over into the ventral white column, coming upwards, synapsing on the inferior olives. The inferior olives will then do what? They'll then cross that information over into the contralateral cerebellum. There's an important reason to mention this. One of the reasons why is that these fibers that are going into the cerebellum here, right, going into the cerebellum is very important, coming from the inferior olives. These are called climbing fibers. I want you guys to burn this into your memories. These are called climbing fibers. So the climbing fibers are going to be the fibers coming from the inferior olivary nucleus going into the cerebellum via the inferior cerebellar peduncles. All the other sensory fibers going into the cerebellum are called mossy fibers. Okay, good. So we covered here, which one was this one? Spinal cord to olives. That's spino-olivary tract. What about that olivospinal tract? There's a lot of controversy. Some of the books I read in an article said that there's a little bit of controversy and doubt on whether this tract actually exists. I'm going to just briefly cover it, okay? Because there is some newer things that they're saying. The inferior olives are believed to receive information from the red nucleus, right? So you know the cerebellum has a bunch of different cerebellar nuclei, right? The dentate, the emboliform, the globose, all of those things. They believe that some of the information will go into the contralateral red nucleus from these deep cerebellar nuclei, right? And that these red nuclei can then send some of this information down to these inferior olives, okay? So what does that mean? Remember, the cerebellum is aware of all of your proprioceptive sensations. It knows where your muscles, your tendons, your ligaments, your joint capsules are in space. It sends it to the red nucleus. Red nucleus sends this to the inferior olives. It receives that sensation. The cortex also has the ability, let's do this in a different color here. Let's do pink. The cortex also has the ability to send down the motor plan to the inferior olives, letting them know what the motor plan is. So the cerebellum tells the inferior olives all the position of your muscles, your tendons, your joint capsules, all that stuff. Cortex tells them the motor plan. Then here's the interesting newer information that I read about. You know where you have the putamen and the globus pallidus externus and internus, all of that comportion of like the striatum, they are believed to send information down to the inferior olives. This is the newest thing, and this is what they believe it might be involved in. So they believe that there might be some type of connection or association between the basal ganglia and the inferior olives. But here's the final concept. What they think is that the inferior olives will send down descending motor fibers. They'll send down descending motor fibers, and these descending motor fibers will go to muscles that are believed to control reflexive movements. Okay, that's all that we really know. It's kind of unknown about this tract, but again, I wanted to make sure that you guys understand there is some belief that the inferior olives receive information from the cerebello-rubral olivary fibers, and they also receive information from the cortex, and they receive information from the striatum. The newest information is that they believe there's an association between the striatum, the basal part of the basal ganglia, and the inferior olives. And they believe that it's involved with reflexive movements. Okay? That covers these inferior olives. Now, let's move on. Okay, we've already covered this one like a million times too, but the vestibular system. You guys remember the vestibular nuclei, superior, medial, inferior, lateral, they're all receiving information from what? They're receiving information from two things. One is from the inner ear, right? From the cristae ampullaris, right? And then the macula, right? You guys remember these structures. Cristae ampullaris is for the rotational acceleration. Macula is going to be for more of the linear acceleration. They send information to these vestibular nuclei. Then you have the vestigial nucleus, and he sends information to the vestibular nuclei about all the different proprioceptive sensations in the body. Now, this vestibular nuclei then has a choice. It decides, I'm going to send descending information down to motor fibers to cause contraction of specific muscles, extensor muscles, anti-gravity muscles. What is this tract? This is going down to the spinal cord from the vestibular nucleus. This is your vestibulospinal tract. We talked about that one. Then it also can connect from the vestibular nucleus. It can connect to the vestigial nucleus, right? We know that there's a connection between those via the inferior cerebellar peduncles, via the juxtarestiform body. So it can go into the cerebellum, it can go down to the spinal cord, or it can send information up to the thalamus, and it can do one more thing. It can send information to your abducens nerve. And then the abducens nerve will do what? It'll send information to the contralateral third and fourth nerve nucleus. What is that blue tract? The medial longitudinal fasciculus, right? So the medial longitudinal fasciculus technically can extend from the medulla all the way up to the midbrain. Okay? So we know now vestibulospinal tract. We know the connection to the vestigial nucleus via the inferior cerebellar peduncles. We know the connection between the vestibular nucleus and the medial longitudinal fasciculus. That covers it. Boom, we move on. All right, so let's cover this next point. We already talked about the tectospinal tract and the rubrospinal tract like 1,000 times. It's worth repeating though, right? So tectospinal, superior colliculus, inferior colliculus, we already know that's a part of the tectum, posterior portion of that midbrain, right? Sends information downwards that can go to 2 points. One, to the spinal cord. What is that called? The tectospinal tract, right? But it can also give off fibers to go to the cranial nerve nuclei that go and supply different muscles of the eye. What is the importance of this tectospinal tract? It's to supply muscles of the head and neck via the spinal cord and muscles of the eye for reflexive movements. If someone calls your name, that stimulates the inferior colliculus. Move your head and your eyes that way. If you're watching somebody move, that's the superior colliculus, and it's going to be causing you to move your head and your eyes in that direction. If you step on something, when you step on something, it sends information upwards to your tectum, lets your tectum know that you're receiving this sensory information. What is that called? Let's do this in a different color, just to recap this. You receive sensory information, you step on something. That comes here into your actual spinal cord, ascends upwards, stimulates the tectum. What is that tract called? You better tell me. The spinotectal tract. The one going down is the tectospinal tract. Okay, last one here, red nucleus. We know this one, right? We know that this guy is it forms that ventral tegmental decussation and then descends downwards, goes to lower motor neurons that go to the flexor muscles, primarily of the upper extremity. Done. Okay, let's move on. All right, so the next one we got to cover is that sympathetic tract. You guys remember the sympathetic tract, right? Sympathetic tract, remember you have the hypothalamus, right? The hypothalamus has two portions. One portion that's a parasympathetic portion here. We'll draw the parasympathetic portion. We'll do it in here like a red. And then there's a portion of the hypothalamus that has a sympathetic portion. That's going to be in this baby bluish teal color, right? This hypothalamus will have fibers that will then come backwards, posteriorly, and then descend downwards through the midbrain, through the pons, through the medulla, and go into the spinal cord where it'll synapse on preganglionic motor neurons within the thoracolumbar portion of the spinal cord. And then from this, do you guys remember what we said here from that T1 all the way to like L2, that thoracolumbar outflow? That's all going to be for sympathetic outflow. So I just wanted to make sure we understand what the heck the sympathetic tract is. The sympathetic tract is that descending sympathetic pathway coming from the hypothalamus that'll then synapse on some of these, the preganglionic motor neurons located within the intermedial lateral portion of the spinal cord at T1 to L2 that'll control the thoracolumbar outflow. Boom. Let's move on. All right, so next thing we got to cover that we talked about in those medulla structures was the spinocerebellar tracts. And again, we're not going to go into total detail on this. If you guys want, we have another video on this. But to give you an idea of what they're doing, remember, you have that the dorsal spinocerebellar tract. You guys remember, we talked about it really quickly in that video. If you have here midline portion of the spinal cord, right? And let's say that we go here at the top, we have C1. Then we'll go about right here, we'll say that's about C8. Then we'll go about right here, let's say that's like L2, L3. Then we'll go down a little bit more and let's say that this is going to be like coccygeal 1, okay? If you guys remember from C8, well actually let's do this in order. From C1 to C8, this was picked up by that cuneocerebellar tract. I'm just going to put CT. Okay, and then from C8 to L2, L3, this was picked up by that dorsal spinocerebellar tract. We'll put DCT. And then from L2, L3 down to the coccygeal 1 was picked up by the ventral spinocerebellar tract. We'll put VCT. Okay? This is basically picking up proprioceptive sensations, some pressure, and even a little bit of touch, and taking it to the cerebellum, which has a kind of an unconscious, basically awareness of all of these proprioceptive and touch sensations, okay? And they're carrying it to the cerebellum. Again, really quickly to cover this, cuneocerebellar, that's taking it kind of like mainly from C1 to C8, okay? So you're getting more of like the neck, a teensy bit of like the upper extremities, okay? So you're going to have that cuneocerebellar tract, picking up proprioceptive sensations, moving into the dorsal gray horn, moving into that little funiculus, ascending upwards and going to that. Remember this guy? The accessory cuneate nucleus. So here, let's remind this. What color do we have? Okay, here was the nucleus cuneatus. Nucleus cuneatus. What did we have medially, guys? You guys better tell me. Nucleus gracilis, nucleus gracilis. So there's another nucleus just lateral to that called the accessory cuneate nucleus. It's receiving information from the cuneocerebellar tract, will go to this nucleus and then send it in via the inferior cerebellar peduncle into the cerebellum. Okay? Boom, done. Dorsal spinocerebellar tract. Receive proprioceptive sensations from the structures from C8 to L2, L3. Takes that into the dorsal gray horn. When it synapses in the dorsal gray horn, it moves ipsilateral into the lateral white column, right? And then does what? It ascends. And then as it ascends, what does it do? Eventually it will go into the inferior cerebellar peduncles. And it'll synapse there, right? Again, this is your dorsal spinocerebellar tract. The light blue one here is your cuneocerebellar tract. And let's hit the last one, which I think we had in pink and over there. So that was going to be the ventral spinocerebellar tract. So this is picking up proprioceptive sensations, touch sensations from L2, L3 down to coccygeal 1, comes into that dorsal gray horn, synapses, and then what does it do? It crosses over and it moves into the lateral white column, but more ventrally to the dorsal spinocerebellar tract. And then does what? Ascends upwards, and then it goes all the way up to the midbrain at the superior cerebellar peduncles. And then what does it do? It does that really weird thing where it moves into the cerebellum via the superior cerebellar peduncles and then runs behind the midbrain into the contralateral cerebellum. Okay? Because everything from these proprioceptives to the cerebellum, these pathways all have to be ipsilateral. So again, that covers those tracts, giving you an idea of what they're doing, putting a function to the name. Sweet. And again, do you guys remember what these nuclei are called from C1 as we go down here? Remember that? That was called Clark's column. So again, those are those first order neurons that are within the dorsal gray horn that they're synapsing on and then either crossing over or moving into the same lateral white column. All right. Sweet deal. All right, let's move on to the last thing here, and then we'll cover the cranial nerves a little bit. But this was that cochlear pathway. You guys remember what the cochlear nerve pathway does? Well, I think we've done this like 3 times. But it's always worth repeating, I guess, right? So let's hit this one. Again, you got the inner ear coming from what portion of the inner ear? The cochlea. What part of the cochlea? The spiral organ of Corti, which is taking auditory sensations. Remember, vestibular cochlear nerve. It has the 2 portions, cochlear branch, vestibular branch. This is going to be the vestibular branch. The cochlear branch. And that synapses on what 2 structures in that pons medulla junction? The cochlear nuclei. The ventral cochlear nuclei and the dorsal cochlear nuclei. Then, what did we say? Some of the dorsal cochlear nuclei will cross over and ascend up. Some of these ventral cochlear nuclei, what do? They'll cross over and they'll ascend up. But some of them will synapse on what structure? Remember, some of them will synapse on a structure called the superior olives. All right, some of them will synapse on the superior olives, and then those will ascend upwards. But do you guys remember what this is called whenever there's this crossing of the cochlear nuclei? That's called the trapezoid body. We talked about that before in the pons. But you got the cochlear nuclei. They receive information via the vestibular cochlear nerve, synapse on these cochlear nuclei. Some of the cochlear nuclei will cross. Some of them will synapse on the superior olives and then ascend upwards. When they ascend upwards, they go to a portion of the midbrain that you guys know called the inferior colliculus. What is this structure, though, called that's ascending upwards? Do you guys remember? This was called the lateral lemniscus. And eventually it'll synapse on the inferior colliculus in the midbrain. And the inferior colliculus will have a connection called the brachium of the inferior colliculus. And that brachium of the inferior colliculus will connect to the thalami. And the thalamus will then relay that information to the temporal lobe. Okay, so again, what I want you to remember is that the cochlear nuclei that are in that area are responsible for sensory information, primarily hearing. Okay, covered that. Let's finish up briefly talking about these cranial nerves that we've seen within the medulla. Again, we have videos that discuss these cranial nerves in way more detail on their anatomy. We're just going to cover the general functions of them here. All right, so now what I want to do is just really kind of just basic overview. I just want you guys to be able to know what the functions of these things are, because whenever there's lesions, because that's what we're going to have to cover, medullary lesions, what can happen if there's damage to the hypoglossal nerve? You just have to know the general functions, okay? So hypoglossal nerve is responsible for movement of the tongue, right? So it's primarily a motor nerve. And the types of motor fibers that it has is those general somatic efferent fibers. But I want you to know is that it controls the muscles of the tongue, okay? And again, what kind of fibers are they? Just to kind of write it down here, this is GSE fibers, general somatic efferent fibers. I want you guys to tell me though, just so we know, because one of them is very important, the muscles of the tongue. What are the muscles? The styloglossus, the hyoglossus, what else do we got? We got the genioglossus. This is the really important one that I want us to really know. And then the last one is your intrinsic muscles of the tongue. If you guys really want to know styloglossus really quickly, elevates the back of the tongue, kind of retracts it. Hyoglossus depresses, retracts. Genioglossus, primarily protrusion of the tongue, if you guys remember. It does play a little bit with retraction, but primarily protrusion of the tongue. And then intrinsic muscles of the tongue, they help you to change the shape of the tongue, right? Like, doing something like that. So it's really important that you guys understand the function of the hypoglossal nerve, but the real big one that I want you guys to know is it's going to come up when we talk about lesions is the genioglossus. Again, primarily for that protrusion of the tongue. Okay. Glossopharyngeal nerve. This is a mammoth, not as compared to the vagus, but it's a pretty beast, kind of guy. We're going to cover some of the nuclei that we talked about, okay? What was one of the nuclei that we hit? We went as we went medially, we hit hypoglossal nucleus, dorsal nucleus of vagus. What was that next one? The nucleus of tractus solitarius, right? If you guys remember, the nucleus of tractus solitarius is important because it picks up sensory information from what kind of structures. So let me draw here a tiny diagram here for you. So again, here we're going to have the kind of a sagittal section here, and then what we'll do is we'll draw kind of a little small section here for this guy's face, okay? Okay, so what I want you guys to know here is the tongue, right? The tongue, you have different taste that comes from the tongue. And these taste fibers, right, that it's going to be serving what portion of the tongue? The posterior 1/3 of the tongue. The taste sensations from the posterior 1/3 of the tongue is going to be taking this into the medulla and going to what nucleus? The nucleus of tractus solitarius. So what is one of the functions of the glossopharyngeal nerve? Because it connects with that nucleus of tractus solitarius. It plays a role within taste of what portion of the posterior 1/3 of the tongue. Okay, cool. What was another structure that we talked about there? Another one is that it's also associated with that nucleus ambiguus. Do you guys remember the nucleus ambiguus when we talked about that? The nucleus ambiguus controls a lot of different muscles, but one of the muscles that it goes to is called the stylopharyngeus. Do you guys remember that guy? The stylopharyngeus helps to kind of elevate the soft palate. That was another one. But what was the nucleus that was associated with it? The nucleus ambiguus. That was one of the nuclei that we talked about over there. So it also plays a role within the deglutition process, right? So it also plays a role within the deglutition process, okay? Because the stylopharyngeus does help to play a role with kind of elevating that soft palate. Going back here, taste. What kind of fibers is it that's actually carrying there? That is do you guys remember? SVA fibers, sensory visceral afferent fibers. The fibers for deglutition, These are motor fibers. This is your SVE fibers. That's your special visceral efferent fibers. You guys remember, special visceral efferent is for pharyngeal arches. Which pharyngeal arch does the glossopharyngeal nerve serve? The third pharyngeal arch. First is trigeminal, second is facial, third is glossopharyngeal. Okay, cool. We had another nucleus. The other nucleus that we had there was the inferior salivatory nucleus. And the inferior salivatory nucleus, we said, would go to the otic ganglion and then go to a gland. What was that gland called? The parotid gland. What does the parotid gland do? Plays a role with salivation. You guys are so awesome. I know you guys knew that, right? So it also plays a role with salivation. And again, via what nucleus? The inferior salivatory nucleus. What kind of fibers is that? General visceral efferent fibers. I knew you guys knew that, right? So general visceral efferent fibers. Cool. Okay. The other thing it does is it picks up sensory information from the soft palate, from the pharynx, from the posterior 1/3 of the tongue. Okay, we already said the soft palate uvula. So again, what does it also pick up? It picks up sensory sensations, okay? So visceral sensations coming from the posterior 1/3 of the tongue, coming from the soft palate, coming from the uvula, coming from the pharynx, and carries it back. And they believe that most of these fibers synapses on the nucleus of tractus solitarius. What are these fibers, the sensory fibers that are picking up sensations from the soft palate, the uvula, the posterior 1/3 of the tongue, the pharynx? These are GVA fibers. If you guys want to be rock stars, which I know you guys are, it also picks up some sensations from the areas called the carotid bodies and the carotid sinus, right? You guys know you have aortic arch. And then you have your sinus there. And again, the sinus is going to be having the baroreceptors. The baroreceptors are going to be picking up, they're going to have these GVA fibers that will also be carried on the glossopharyngeal nerve. And then you're also going to have the carotid bodies, which are going to be carrying the chemoreceptor information. That's also going to be carried on the glossopharyngeal nerve. But again, all of these fibers, sensations from the soft palate, from the posterior 1/3 of the tongue, all that stuff. And then from these chemoreceptors and baroreceptors is all carried on GVA fibers. So it plays a role with sensations. We're just going to put of oral cavity. Okay, of the oral cavity. And again, those sensations that we're picking up from the chemoreceptors and the baroreceptors. The last one, that's really kind of an easy one, thank goodness, is that it's also picking up sensations, pain sensations from the external ear. Pain, temperature, touch sensations from the external ear, tympanic membrane, middle ear, pharyngotympanic tube. So it's also picking up kind of ear sensations. Okay, and those types of sensations go to your spinal nucleus of the trigeminal nerve. Okay, so again, that's all the kind of the functions of the glossopharyngeal nerve. Let's move on to this beast, the vagus nerve. Again, this one's, it will never cover everything here, so again, it's just general. Vagus nerve, what I want you to remember, you have that dorsal nucleus of vagus. The dorsal nucleus of vagus carries primarily general visceral afferent fibers, which are all the sensations of your larynx, of parts of the soft palate, of all your thorax and abdominal parts of your abdominal viscera, all of that information, secretion, contraction, and sensations are all kind of carried to and out of the dorsal nucleus of vagus that we talked about over there. So again, if we were to cover some for the GVA fibers, it picks up sensations. Okay, and we can say here from what structures? From the larynx, the trachea, we're going to go on forever here. We'll put thorax, abdomen, all of that stuff, right? And then also plays a role within secretion and motor function, so peristalsis and things like that, right? So secretion from glands and peristaltic activity. So it plays a role within secretion and motor functions, all for the same thing, for structures of the larynx, for the trachea, for the thorax, for the abdomen, all of these different things. And again, if you guys want more detail on that, go watch that video. The other thing, so again, what kind of the sensations are carried on what things? GVA. The secretal motor fibers are GVE, and these are primarily coming from the dorsal nucleus of vagus. The nucleus retractus solitarius also is going to be receiving information from the vagus nerve. That's picking up taste from primarily the oropharynx, the posterior wall, right, of the pharynx, the oropharynx, and even it also will pick up some sensations from like the valleculae on the epiglottis, so taste sensations. So those are special visceral afferent fibers. So it plays a tiny role within taste, okay? And again, the two portions that it picks it up on is the oropharynx, and there's also a tiny bit of taste receptors on the epiglottis. Okay, the valleculae of the epiglottis. And what kind of fibers are those? SVA fibers. What are they going to? The nucleus of tractus solitarius. Okay, it also plays a role and has connections to the nucleus ambiguus. The nucleus ambiguus is going to have what kind of fibers? SVE fibers that we talked about for the glossopharyngeal nerve. It's also going to have SVE fibers for the vagus nerve. That's going to be going to muscles of the pharynx, the pharyngeal constrictors, muscles of the larynx, okay? And that's really, really important for the deglutition process and for phonation, right? So the laryngeal muscles, right? So you have your cricopharyngeus, you have your cricothyroid, you have all those cricoarytenoid muscles, all of those things that are important for phonation, for speech. And then the superior, middle, inferior pharyngeal constrictors for that kind of deglutition process. So again, those are going to be coming from the nucleus ambiguus via the SVE. SVE fibers, that's going to be basically supplying the pharyngeal arches. The vagus nerve supplies what two pharyngeal arches? 4 and 6. 1 is trigeminal, 2 is facial, 3 is glossopharyngeal, 4 and 6 is vagus. Good. So it's going to supply muscles of larynx for speech and the muscles of the pharynx, primarily those constrictors for deglutition. And thankfully, the last thing is it also picks up pain, temperature, touch sensations from the external ear, the tympanic membrane, and even a little bit of the middle ear cavity. So again, it picks up sensations from the ear. And again, what kind of fibers are those going to be? Those are going to be your GSA fibers. What kind of structure is it going to go to? The spinal nucleus of the trigeminal nerve. Boom. Okay. Finally, oh, thank goodness, the last one, the accessory nerve, cranial nerve 11. So we hit cranial nerve 12, we hit cranial nerve 9, we hit cranial nerve 10, we hit cranial nerve 11 now. Accessory nerve, this guy, thank goodness, it's really important to know that this guy is primarily supplying two muscles, okay? So it primarily has general somatic efferent fibers that supply two muscles. One is the sternocleidomastoid muscle, okay? So the sternocleidomastoid muscle, which has a lot of different functions that we've talked about in other videos. The other one is it supplies the trapezius, okay? This is going to be really important to know these, okay? But here's the other thing. This is primarily supplied by the spinal component, that C1, 2, 3, 4, that moves up through the lateral funiculus and combines with that cranial portion of the accessory nerve we talked about on the external anatomy. They supply primarily the sternocleidomastoid and trapezius. Some of the kind of parts coming off of the brainstem, a little bit of that goes into this internal kind of parts that supply the pharyngeal plexus. Okay, so there's 3 parts of the pharyngeal plexus. Okay, what are the 3 parts of the pharyngeal plexus? One part of the pharyngeal plexus is the vagus nerve. Second part is the glossopharyngeal nerve. And the third part is the accessory nerve. Okay, these 3 structures here make up your pharyngeal plexus. All of these 3 components their pharyngeal plexus is formed by the fibers coming off of the nucleus ambiguus. So again, accessory nerve, a thing that you have to remember is that it is a part of the pharyngeal plexus. So it's a component of the pharyngeal plexus, which is going to be carrying fibers, SVE fibers, from the nucleus ambiguus, and it's one of the three components of the pharyngeal plexus, which is made up of the vagus nerve, the glossopharyngeal nerve, and the accessory nerve. All of the fibers of the nucleus ambiguus that are coming from vagus, glossopharyngeal, and even a little bit from the accessory nerve. Okay? That covers all of the functions of all of these things within the medulla. All right, Ninja Nerds, this was a monster of a video, and we covered so much. It was so in-depth, and I really hope that a lot of this stuff made sense. I hope that you guys did enjoy it. And at the end of this video, I hope that you can literally name every single thing within the medulla and what they do. If you guys did learn a lot from this video, if you loved this video, please hit that like button, comment down in the comment section, and please subscribe. Also, if you guys get a chance, down in the description box, we'll have links to everything that you guys need to communicate with us. Facebook, Instagram, even our Patreon, all of those things. If you guys want to go there, check that out. We appreciate it. Ninja Nerds, we love you. We thank you for everything that you do, all the support and kind comments that you give. We do look at them, and we do appreciate them. All right, Ninja Nerds, as always, until next time.